Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Self-Sovereign podcast. We discuss a range of topics related to autonomy and self-empowerment. My name is Justin Smith. I'm an independent documentary filmmaker. Our guest today is Dr. Sarah Myhill. Dr. Sarah Myhill qualified as a medical doctor in 1981, and she worked in the National Health Service in the UK for 20 years. But she found the National Health Service to be very restrictive and not serving patients well. So she decided to set up her own independent medical practice. Dr. Myhill believes that patients really want to know what the causes are of their medical problems and what nutritional, lifestyle, or environmental changes they can make to bring about improvements in their health. Dr. Myhill has written a number of books. Her book on the diagnosis and treatment of chronic fatigue syndrome received an award from the British Medical Association, and her book Sustainable Medicine received a People's Book Prize. However, today we're going to be talking about Dr. Myhill's latest book, The Underactive Thyroid, Do It Yourself Because Your Doctor Won't. I should also mention that Dr. Myhill features in my upcoming documentary film, In the Shadow of Flexner. So, Dr. Myhill, could you start by telling us the reason that you wrote the book and the reasons why someone needs to do this thyroid treatment for themselves?
The underactive thyroid is a very, very common clinical condition. It's hugely underdiagnosed. It's roughly 1 or 2% of the population actually receives thyroid hormones. The conventional endocrinologists accept that maybe up to 8% of the population may be underactive and they're already underdiagnosing it. But there is one clinician in America, Dr. Kenneth Blanchard, who reckons it probably afflicts maybe up to 30% of the population. In the people that I see with chronic fatigue syndrome and ME, my guess is it's more than half of those. So it is common, and the diagnosis is often missed. And that's why that's why I call the book Do It Yourself Because Your Doctor Won't. And the reason that the diagnosis is missed is because the doctors solely rely on blood tests. They never look at the clinical symptoms and they never look at the clinical signs. And worse than that, they often just rely on one aspect of the blood test, which is the TSH. So patients who rightly and correctly work out that they think their symptoms accord with a diagnosis of the underactive thyroid go to their doctors, they have a TSH measured, they're told there's nothing wrong with their thyroid, and the diagnosis is missed. And that is serious, because the underactive thyroid is a major cause of chronic fatigue, and it's also a major risk factor for cancer, for heart disease, and for dementia. So it's an important diagnosis to make, and the awful thing is people have got to do it themselves.
And Is the low thyroid, hypothyroid, much more common than other thyroid-related problems?
Yes, the underactive thyroid is 10 times, no, more than that, 50 times more common than the overactive thyroid. Now, I do touch on the overactive thyroid in the book, but this book is largely about how to correct the underactive thyroid, how to recognize the clinical symptoms, how to use the clinical signs to confirm the diagnosis, and then which tests are going to be helpful to support that. And the key point to remember here is that all diagnosis is hypothesis. We only know the true diagnosis in response to treatment. So what we are doing is we are hypothesizing that person has an underactive thyroid. We are putting in place the necessary interventions to address that and seeing how that person responds to treatment. And if the response is positive, then we know we've got the diagnosis correct.
And how does someone know that they are hypothyroid? Is it a combination of the clinical picture and specific blood tests?
The key point is to have that high index of suspicion. And the symptoms of the underactive thyroid are common and so often put down to something else. And very commonly, women in particular are told, oh, it's because you're getting old. Oh, it's because you're going through the menopause. Oh, it's because you're stressed. So the doctor, instead of listening carefully to what that person is telling them, they come to a quick conclusion like that with no evidence base brush over the patient's symptoms and they're told to go away. So, for example, depression is commonly a symptom of the underactive thyroid, but so often patients just put on symptom-suppressing medication that simply makes them emotionally numb and stops them caring without addressing the root cause of why they are depressed.
And so how does the process go? So someone suspects that they may be hypothyroid, and then is it essential that they do a blood test before they go further, or what would be the next stage?
Well, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what are the symptoms of the underactive thyroid? Now, the analogy which I love to use that everybody understands for my chronic fatigue syndrome patients is the car analogy. And for your car to go, there are 4 important players. You've got to have the right fuel in the tank, then have to have the mitochondrial engine, then you have to have the thyroid accelerator pedal and the adrenal gearbox. So to improve energy delivery mechanism, all 4 of those need to be in place. Now, the symptoms of poor energy delivery are, first of all, obviously physical fatigue. People say, I just haven't got the energy I know I should have. I can't keep up with my peers. I'm just not living up to my full potential. They have no stamina. All their activities have to be carefully paced. And worst of all, if they overdo things, then they pay for it the next day with post-exertional malaise. So that delayed fatigue is a pathognomonic of a chronic fatigue syndrome, a pathological chronic fatigue syndrome. Then we have symptoms of poor energy delivery to the brain. And if the brain doesn't have the energy it needs to function, then it will go slow. It cannot think clearly, it cannot multitask, poor short-term memory, cannot problem solve. It just doesn't function, as efficiently. People think they're stupid. They know they're clever, but they cannot live up to their intellectual potential. And then, of course, the brain will give us symptoms to stop us from spending energy. Because the point here is that we have a certain bucket of energy to spend in a day. And if you spend more energy than you have available, then you will die. And therefore, the body and the brain give us symptoms to stop us overspending energy, to protect us from death. And some of those brain symptoms will be symptoms like depression, because what happens when people are depressed? They don't want to do things, they don't want to socialize, they don't want to go out to work, because the brain's saying, we haven't got the energy to do that. So I think depression is partly an energy delivery mechanism. In very severe cases where there's poor energy delivery to the heart will not be able to beat powerfully as a pump, and the blood pressure will fall. And some people end up with such low blood pressures that they can only function horizontal. They can't even stand up, because every time they stand up, the blood pressure drops even more, and the pulse races and they fall over. That's called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and that occurs in my severe patients when they have severe chronic fatigue syndrome. And of course, the thyroid is part of all that. And then on top of that, if you've got poor energy delivery mechanisms, the immune system won't work well. The immune system will not have the energy to fight infections. And so you're going to be more susceptible to COVID infections, for example. You're more likely to pick up coughs and colds and flus and such like. If you haven't got good energy to the gut, then you won't digest your food sufficiently. You will rapidly go into anaerobic metabolism, produce lactic acid, and you'll get aching, painful muscles and fibromyalgia. So the thyroid is part of energy delivery mechanisms, and any one of those symptoms can be explained by the underactive thyroid. But there are some symptoms that are peculiar to the thyroid gland. So, for example, it's responsible for your pulse rate at rest. So if first thing in the morning, lying in bed, you feel your pulse rate, if it's much below 70 beats per minute, and some people come to me with a resting pulse at 55 or 58 or 62 beats a minute, then always think thyroid. The thyroid is responsible for growth. So if you've got poor quality hair, thinning hair, poor quality skin, poor quality nails, loss of the outer third of the eyebrows, again, think thyroid. And again, if the thyroid gland is underactive, you will tend to retain fluid. In fact, another name for the underactive thyroid is mixed edema. And if you've got edema, if you've got fluid retention, then you will tend to have a puffy face. So I often suggest to people, look at your photographs, how you were 20 years, 30 years ago. Are you still recognizable? If not, you've got a puffy face, think thyroid. Look at the tongue. Often the tongue gets too big. It's called macroglossia. And if you look along the side of the tongue, you might see teeth marks where the teeth have rested against the tongue and indented it. Voice changes. If the vocal cords are edematous, then people end up with a croaky voice like they've been smoking for the last 50 years. And what some people say, they've lost their singing voice. They can't hit those high notes. If you get fluid retention in the wrist, then you can get nerve compression symptoms like carpal tunnel syndrome. It's not uncommon for people to present with that. Tingling in your hands or your feet can be a nerve compression symptom. So these are all the typical symptoms of the underactive thyroid that you have to think about. Another useful clinical clue is your core temperature, because it's very important that we run at just the right temperature. All the enzymes that generate energy need heat for them to function. And if you're running cold, then all those enzymes will go slow. So the sum total of all energy delivery mechanisms, as I say, the fueling the tank, which is diet and gut function, the mitochondrial engine, the thyroid accelerator pedal, the adrenal gearbox, the sum total of that will be your core temperature. So measuring your core temperature first thing in the morning before rising is often a useful clue. So the point then is you then have the clinical... and there are other clinical clues as well. The underactive thyroid is much more common in women. It's much more common if you have another autoimmune condition. The problem runs very strongly in families. So if you have a family history of mother, grandmother, aunt, uncle having an underactive thyroid, then again, it's more likely that you will too. So those are all the sort of clinical clues that make one think of this as a possible diagnosis. And then we have to look at the blood tests. And to make a complete diagnosis of the underactive thyroid, we need to measure a T4, a T3, and a TSH. Now, let me just explain that. It's the pituitary gland that produces thyroid-stimulating hormone, TSH. And that... that reminds me, I've forgotten another important clinical clue. The pituitary gland produces TSH, and that spikes at midnight. So we have the highest level of TSH at 12 o'clock. TSH, thyroid-stimulating hormone, travels around the body and kicks the thyroid gland into action, and that starts to put out T4. Now, T4 is one of the thyroid hormones. It's called T4 because it has 4 iodine atoms. And that spikes at about 4 o'clock in the morning. Then T4 is slowly converted to T3, and it's T3 which is the active hormone. T3 will spike at about 5 o'clock in the morning. T3 then circulates around the body and stimulates the adrenal gland to pour out adrenaline and cortisol and DHA, and that is what actually wakes us up. So this is another important clinical clue. Very often people who are hypothyroid, underactive, they have a delayed circadian rhythm. They are owls. They cannot drop off to sleep until maybe 11, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock in the morning, and they naturally wake at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the morning. So that's another important clinical clue. But to get some idea if that person has an underactive thyroid, we have to look at the TSH. Is the pituitary working well to produce the thyroid-stimulating hormone? We have to look at the free T4. Is the thyroid then producing sufficient T4? That then, of course, has to be converted to T3, and that requires selenium and zinc and iron. And T3 is actually the active thyroid hormone that does the business. So to start to diagnose, we have to measure a TSH, we have to measure a free T4, and we have to measure a free T3. And then we have to look at the actual where they lie in the reference range. Because again, so many people will have a T4 of low end of range, and the doctor will say, oh, you are normal, it's in the normal range. And the normal range is 12 to 24 picomoles per litre. But Professor Sir Anthony Toft, who wrote the British Medical Association Guide to Treating the Underactive Thyroid, in his book, he states, and some people do not feel well until their free T4 is running at 30 picomoles per litre. The point here is that we all have our personal range, and that is different from the much narrower than and different from the population range. So the population average may be 12 to 24, but your personal range might be 24 to 27. It might be 17 to 19. We don't know. But those people will be told, if they've got a free T4 of 12.1, oh, you're normal. So the diagnosis will be missed in that case. And of course, the NHS tests do not routinely check a T3. And as I said, it's T3, which is the active hormone. Some people are poor converters of T4 to T3. And just the other day, I saw somebody who had a T4 of 24. The TSH was high normal. It was 3.3. And their free T3 was right at low end of range. The range is 3.2 to 6.8, and their result was 2.9. And they were told, oh, you're normal because your T4 is high. But of course, I expect that person to do very well by dint of taking T3. The real reason to do the blood tests is to make sure that that person is not overactive, because the last thing we want to do is to give thyroid hormones to somebody who is overactive. Doing the tests also gives us an idea if there is biochemical scope for a trial of thyroid, because having hypothesized that that person has an underactive thyroid because of their symptoms, because their signs, i.e. their clinical picture, having established that there is biochemical scope for a trial of thyroid, at that point, we then have to put in place a trial of thyroid and see how they respond to treatment.
Could I ask a couple of very quick questions so far? So just briefly going back to the clinical picture and the core temperature. How is the core temperature measured? Is that underneath the tongue, in the armpit, or does it not matter?
Under the tongue and in the armpit, they're okay, but that will be about half a degree below actual core temperature. Ideal is a rectal temperature. That gives you the best measure of core temperature. And what people often do is they do a rectal temperature and they also do an oral, and then they work out what their difference is. So if the oral temperature is consistently half a degree below, then that's a pretty good idea. But even the very simple NHS device that you just point at your forehead to measure the infrared, that gives a pretty good idea of core temperature. They cost about 12 quid. They're very cheap, very quick, very easy, and that's a useful tool.
Okay, great. And then I understand why you emphasize the importance of the blood test, and I understand it's really important to make sure that it's not overactive, the thyroid is not overactive. But what about someone who's in a situation where they feel pretty sure within themselves that they have they fit the symptom profile, the clinical profile, but they don't have access to the test? Would it be advisable for those people to...
Well, everybody has access to tests because you can do it yourself at home. And there are many laboratories, and I set up a website called Natural Health Worldwide, and on there is a list of all the tests where anybody can get a do-it-yourself blood test done. You just prick your finger, a little kit will be sent to you, prick your finger or the palm of your hand, squeeze some blood into the bottles, send it off to the lab, and you get all those things measured fairly inexpensively.
That's great, thank you. And then, so if someone is then hypothesized to have a low thyroid function, what would be the next step for them to take?
Okay. Well, the important thing to remember here is that the thyroid is just part of energy delivery mechanisms. And the thyroid gland has its effect on energy through its effect on the engines of our car, that is, say, our mitochondria. So before we start throwing thyroid around, we have to make sure that the mitochondria are in a fit state to respond. And for mitochondria to be in a fit state to respond, they need the right fuel in the tank and the micronutrients to allow the various aspects of mitochondria to function. So we have to go back to the diet and gut function. So everybody, that I would never consider treating anybody with thyroid glandulars until they had established the paleo-ketogenic diet, taken a good package of nutritional supplements because we are all deficient thanks to modern farming processes, that we have good gut function because nothing will heal until the gut is functioning well, and the commonest problem is what I call the upper fermenting gut. The upper gut should be a sterile carnivorous gut like a dog. The lower bowel, the last 3 foot of the intestine, should be a vegetarian fermenting gut. The problem with modern Western diets is that we eat far too many carbohydrates. Why? They're cheap, convenient, and addictive, and we eat them in an addictive way. But if we eat too many carbohydrates, we overwhelm the ability of the upper gut to remain sterile, and it starts to ferment, and that causes a whole host of problems. That alone will cause foggy brain and fatigue. Why? Because we are fermenting to toxins. It's called the auto-brewery syndrome. So if you eat a bunch of grapes, for example, they're covered with yeast, they're full of sugar, and you will ferment to produce alcohol. Now, and a lot of alcohol too. So, if you gave me a glass of wine at breakfast, I would get nothing done in the day. I can't blame the thyroid for that. It's all to do with diet. So the starting point is a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet. And that gives the mitochondria its preferred fuel in the tank. So having got that right, and that alone may improve your symptoms of the underactive thyroid. Having got that right, we then have to look at the mitochondria. Now, usually, people have to be pretty well fatigued, to have a mitochondrial dysfunction. A rough rule of thumb that I use is that if your energy levels are less than 70% of what you think they should be, and I know this is rather rough, then it's likely you have a mitochondrial issue. And mitochondria can go slow because maybe they lack the raw materials to function. And again, I detail these in the book, but the common deficiencies are magnesium, coenzyme Q10, vitamin B3, and acetyl-L-carnitine. They come up all the time. Mitochondria may be going slow because they are blocked by something, they're inhibited. And the commonest one there is lactic acid. And this particularly applies to people with fatigue syndrome who are not pacing their activity. And so they're switching to anaerobic metabolism, and that produces lactic acid, and that will inhibit mitochondria. But it can be anything. It can be chemicals from the outside world, like glyphosate. Glyphosate is a particularly nasty toxic chemical. It is an organophosphate, and the business of making energy in mitochondria is called oxidative phosphorylation, and organophosphates inhibit oxidative phosphorylation. So heavy metals will block their mitochondria as well. So we have to think, does this person need to do any sort of detox regime? And of course, products of the fermenting gut will inhibit mitochondria. So before we even think about a trial of thyroglobulins, I want to look at the diet, the gut function, and the mitochondrial function. And if all that is in place, and again, that's detailed in the book, then yes, we can do a trial of thyroid hormones. Now, the key point to remember about any trial is we start with very low doses and we build up very slowly. And the reason for that is twofold. The first reason is that thyroid T4 is quite long-acting in the body. And if you increase the dose too quickly, then you will overshoot and miss that sweet spot of the perfect dose. So I like to start off with 15 milligrams of thyroid glandular daily. Take it first thing in the morning, sublingually, where you get the best absorption from under the tongue. Of course, some will be swallowed, but the more you can hold it under the tongue, the better. And build up at the rate of 15 milligrams every week. And there's a second reason to go slowly, which is that thyroid hormones don't just determine how fast the mitochondria go, they also, to a certain extent, determine the number of mitochondria. And so mitochondria respond to the thyroid accelerator pedal by increasing their numbers. And that takes time as well. That doesn't happen overnight. And again, it needs raw material to be able to achieve such. So we have to go slowly. And of course, if you've got lots of mitochondria, that's the difference between driving a Deux Chevaux, a 500cc, and a Rolls Royce at 4 litres or whatever. I want my body to be a Rolls Royce, not have a small engine. So we gradually increase the dose. And during that, as we slowly increase the dose, we monitor our symptoms and we monitor our clinical signs. How do we feel? Do we feel better? Is the foggy brain back? Is our quality of sleep improved? Is the edema going down? Is our pulse rate coming up? What's the blood pressure doing? How's our core temperature functioning? So we can monitor this clinically very effectively and very safely. And then, again, in the book details the sort of dose of thyroid glandular one can expect to end up on as determined by your body weight. Big people need bigger doses than little people. So if you were maybe 8 stone, then you would probably only need maybe 60 or 90 milligrams. But if you were 16 stone, then you might need 200 or 250 milligrams. So it's weight dependent. And again, I give you an idea of that in the book. Now,
I think, sorry, I was just going to say, I think a lot of people will be contrasting this with the experience they might have had from their GP, in that, first of all, as you say, the problem usually isn't picked up. But if it is picked up, they're given the synthetic hormone, as I understand. And I'm not sure if you wanted to say something about that here or wait until later.
Well, the synthetic form of thyroxine will do for some people, but there are two big problems with being monitored by your general practitioner. The first is that if you're using the synthetic T4, if you are one of those who has T3 hypothyroidism, that is to say you don't convert T4 to T3 efficiently, then it won't do much good for you. That's the first problem. The second problem is that the doctors do not judge the dose by the clinical picture. They judge the dose by the blood test. And the only bit of the blood test they look at is the TSH. And if the TSH is below their level, now in America, anybody with a TSH above 3 gets put on thyroid hormones. In this country, some doctors won't prescribe thyroid hormones until the TSH is above 6 or 7 or 8. And for adequate thyroid replacement therapy, I like the TSH to be suppressed below 1. So if you're only being judged by the TSH, then very often you will end up being underdosed. So this is why I like people to work it out themselves, to monitor it themselves according to their symptoms and their signs. And yes, blood tests are very helpful as well, because then you'll get the optimum amount of thyroid. And anything less than optimum impacts on your energy and your longevity. So, no one is better motivated to do it than the person themselves, because they want to be well. They want to function at a high level. And if you're going to do that, then the awful thing is you have to do it yourself.
And I guess some people might be a little bit put off by thinking it's a lengthy process. However, I guess the reality is that, of course, there aren't any real shortcuts. And if you jump in doing the wrong thing, it's not going to take you, obviously, in the right direction anyway.
That's right. I mean, people are ill because of decades of the wrong foods, the wrong micronutrients, don't expect to turn it around in a few days. We're talking about weeks here. We're not talking months and years. We're talking weeks and months. And when somebody has been under par for a long time, when they start to heal and repair, you can expect to get what we call a healing crisis. I describe it as DDD reactions: diet, detox, and die-off reactions. Diet, because as you get keto adapted, you can get keto flu as the body learns fat burning. Detox, because as you put all these things in place, the body will get rid of toxins that it's been storing in its fat. And die-off reactions, because as you reduce the load of sugars and carbohydrates, you start to kill off microbes, and then you get allergic reactions to the dead microbes. I've just seen somebody recently who's had the most spectacular rashes as a result of detox and die-off reactions. So I've received daily photographs from her. It's lasted about a week or 10 days, and now it's completely settled on its own. So expect a bumpy ride, which I think of as a healing crisis. And the sicker the person is, the bumpier the ride. And so the skill of putting all this together is doing it fairly slowly and fairly gently in order to minimize those DDD reactions. And because sometimes they can be so awful, it puts people completely off that path to recovery. So, yes, it will take time, but, it's like moving an oil tank that's going through that, in one direction is a very heavy bucket. It's been going that direction for a long time. And if it's heading for the rocks, it's heading to the rocks. And many of the people who come and see me are heading to the rocks. And what we have to do is slowly turn it in the right direction, so it's no longer heading for the rocks. I think there's a Chinese saying that goes something like, if you aren't prepared to change things and change directions, you may end up where you're heading for. So the point is, yes, we have to make the changes. Yes, they're difficult, but massive gains to be had in consequence.
I understand that the thyroid gland works very closely with the adrenal glands. Are there any particular considerations that people need to keep in mind relating to that?
Yes. Yes, if the thyroid is the accelerator pedal, then the adrenal gland is the gearbox of our car. It allows us to gear up in response to stress. Again, the symptoms of adrenal fatigue are going to be all the same symptoms of poor energy delivery mechanisms with respect to the body, the brain, and the heart. But one symptom that's often characteristic of the adrenal gland is that people say, I just can't cope with stress. I can't gear up in response to something over and above the normal that comes into my life. So we should all be trying to run our lives with energy in reserve. And then if that stress comes along, which might be a job loss, it might be a bereavement, it might be a loss of a partner or divorce or something like that, then we have the energy to cope with that. And of course, my fatigue syndrome patients are very stress intolerant. They cannot gear up energy production to deal with those sort of stresses. So that's the most useful symptom. With age, I suspect we all develop adrenal fatigue. And the starting point to make adrenal hormones is actually cholesterol. Cholesterol is the key molecule, the utmost upstream molecule that's produced. 80% of cholesterol is produced in the liver, and then cholesterol gets picked up by the adrenal gland and converted into pregnenolone, which is the first biochemical step. And pregnenolone is a very useful supplement for anybody, probably over the age of 60, and certainly anybody with any of the symptoms that we described. It's inexpensive. You can buy it very over the counter. Again, like thyroid hormones, take it sublingually, take it under the tongue. It's also been dubbed the memory hormone. It also bioconcentrates in the brain. So anybody with any poor short-term memory will often benefit from sublingual pregnenolone. And again, start with the modest dose. For some people as low as 12.5 milligrams, but most 25 milligrams or 50 milligrams. Some need 100 milligrams in order to hit the sweet spot. But as you rightly point out, there's a very happy synergism between thyroid and adrenal hormones. But having said that, the pathway to adrenal health is not as well worn, it's not as well understood as the pathway to thyroid health. The thyroid progression is very straightforward and very well documented. The adrenal ones, it's much more a case of suck it and see. And for some people, DHEA suits them better. And for some people, the herbal preparations work very well. In particular, ginseng and ashwagandha are both very helpful for adrenal function. So there's a bit more trial and error there. But one useful symptom of adrenal fatigue is if the core temperature fluctuates very much. So our core temperature should be pretty constant at about 37 degrees centigrade and fluctuate by maybe up and down, maybe 0.2 or 0.3 degrees centigrade according to our needs. If it fluctuates much more than that, then think adrenal fatigue. So it's a useful objective clue that the adrenal gland is failing. And another useful test, which again anybody can do, is to measure the level of salivary DHEA and salivary cortisol over 24 hours. And that often gives us a very helpful clue if the adrenal gland is not functioning up to par.
And presumably, before anyone would start to do any work as such on the adrenal glands as well, they should follow the preliminary stages that you mentioned previously about the thyroid.
Absolutely. I mean, I often do the thyroid and adrenal glands in parallel, but it should be preceded by the paleo-ketogenic diet, basic package of supplements. Think about mitochondrial function because, again, adrenal hormones manifest through their action on mitochondria. So if your cortisol level shoots up, then mitochondria can increase their output by up to 200, 300% maybe, massive increase. But of course, that's not sustainable long term. And, adrenaline has that effect, cortisol has that effect, and DHEA will have that effect. But adrenaline is the instant response. So if a saber-toothed tiger leaps out at our primitive woman trotting through the jungle, she will have a massive adrenaline hit and run the fastest mile she's ever run in her life. And adrenaline very rarely runs out. That's not the issue. But adrenaline hit is then followed by a cortisol hit, which covers us for some minutes and hours. So adrenaline is minutes to seconds. Cortisol is minutes to hours. And DHEA is the third part of the response. That's hours to days. So we have a staged release of adrenal hormones to deal with stresses, whether they're acute or whether they're chronic. But whatever that stress is, whatever that response to stress is, it's not sustainable. And this is all fabulous work that was detailed in his book, The Stress of Life by Hans Selye in all the 1940s, 1950s. So this is all stuff that's been known for decades. And so the point here is we have to rest between these stresses. And again, sleep is vital for that, of course. Weekends are vital for that. Evenings are vital for that. We all know that we can function at a high level, but we need some chill out time to rest and recover. And that's an essential part of looking after our thyroid and our adrenal glands just as much as the diet and the supplements.
So how do we end up with thyroid and adrenal gland problems? You just mentioned stress, of course. Is stress the main cause of these problems?
Well, it depends on the stress, doesn't it? Because some stresses are good stresses and some stresses are bad stresses. So it's how we personally deal with those particular stresses, and how we respond to that. But one major cause of poor thyroid function, of course, is iodine deficiency. And again, I address this in my book at some length. And iodine deficiency is pandemic. And it's very few people that have sufficient iodine for optimal function. Now, when conventional doctors talk about deficiencies of vitamins and minerals, they're just talking about that amount of substance necessary to prevent disease. So, for example, you can prevent scurvy with maybe as little as 50 milligrams of vitamin C a day. But for optimal biochemical function, for optimal protection against infection, for optimal antioxidant status, I think we need 5 grams a day. That's 100 times that dose. And the same is true of iodine. The recommended daily dose of iodine is 150 micrograms, which is far too low. Okay, you might just about be able to protect yourself from the underactive thyroid with that sort of dose, but it's not ideal for optimal bodily function because it's not just the thyroid that needs iodine. Skeletal muscle, you need iodine is essential. Breasts are essential, and anybody with fibrocystic breast disease, you can cure that simply by abusing iodine. Topically, directly on the breast, or by taking it by mouth. The love hormone, oxytocin, requires iodine. And without that love hormone, oxytocin, then autism can result. So iodine is involved in the pathogenesis of many diseases. It's essential to protect the heart from dysrhythmias. The immune system concentrates iodine in mucous membranes, and that's the first line of defense against disease. So there's a multiplicity of uses of iodine in the body, and my view is we should all be on at least 15 milligrams, which is, certainly 100, possibly 1,000 times the recommended RDA, and some as high need 50 milligrams of iodine for optimum health. So there's a difference between disease prevention and optimum health, and we need good dose of iodine for optimal health, because that's what I want.
Is there a way that we can test if we are iodine deficient and then monitor that as we start to supplement or change our diet?
Well, I don't do tests unless it's going to change clinical management. And the point about iodine is that deficiency is universal. It's one of my favorite multitasking tools because it does so many jobs. It's antioxidants, it's protective against cancer, it helps us strip out heavy metals, it helps us deal with the fermenting gut. It's fabulously safe, so it'd be almost impossible to overdose with it. So I don't bother to test iodine. It's very well excreted from the body. So you can test, but to my view, it's wasted money. I'd much rather people spent their money on the best possible food and supplements that they can lay their hands on.
Would hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, be a symptom of either thyroid or adrenal problems as well?
It certainly can be. But the important point to remember here is that the symptoms of hypoglycemia are not due to low blood sugar. They're due to the adrenaline response. I'll just give you an example of that. A normal blood sugar will be about 4 to 6 millimoles per litre. Millimoles per litre. Ralph Fiennes walked across Antarctica 800 miles unassisted. He and his a co-walker, Mike, surname evades me, who's a doctor. And Mike took blood tests regularly as they were walking across. Now, of course, the most energy-dense foods you can consume are the fat foods. So they were carrying large amounts of butter and fat, and they were in a state of permanent ketosis because that was the most efficient fuel they could carry to power them across the Antarctic. Now, On occasions, the blood sugar, because they're having very low carbohydrate diet, went as low as 0.5. I say normal range, 4 to 6. Very low. They had no symptoms of hypoglycemia. Why? Because they're running happily on ketones. Now, if the body isn't used to running on ketones, it's not keto adapted, then it will be running, when you try to get into ketosis, the body uses adrenaline to fat burn with, and it's the adrenaline that gives you the low blood sugar symptoms. So if somebody's normally running on carbohydrates and their blood sugar goes low, they pour out adrenaline, and it's adrenaline that gives you the symptom. Once you're in ketosis, you've got an adequate fuel supply, you're not having to produce adrenaline, and you're doing it on thyroid hormones, and you don't get any symptoms of hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. Then again, adrenal hormones equally helpful.
Okay. So will someone be able to use your book and then really do everything themselves? So use the information in your book and then be able to order tests online and then have access to the any relevant nutritional supplements or natural hormones that they require.
Correct. All the information you need in the book. And there are many producers of thyroid glandulars. And all thyroid glandulars are the original thyroid replacement therapy and also the best. The first thyroid glandular was applied in the 1890s to, this is the first case of hypothyroidism written up in the literature, and she was treated with dried lamb's thyroid gland. But nowadays we can get it from pigs and we can get it from cattle, from cows. And all it is dried thyroid gland. Now, there are two types. There's pharmaceutical grade, and that is doctor's prescription only. And then there's food grade. So it's actually described officially as a meat. And those are the preparations that are available. And in the index of that book, I detail the many suppliers of thyroid glandulars all over the world, some beef, some pork, that you can access. And I've ordered many, if not all of them, and tried and tested them, and they all are equally effective.
That's great. Thank you very much for your time and all the information, Dr. Myhill. Can you let people know where they can follow your work? And I know that your book is available through your website as well.
Yes, indeed. All my information is at drmyhill.co.uk. And on there's a link to a Facebook group where run by my co-author, Craig Robinson, who does a fabulous job of keeping people informed. And also Natural Health Worldwide, again, run by Katie Twin, who's done a fabulous job of putting people in contact with other therapists and giving them access to the tests that they need so this can be done safely and effectively.
Excellent. Thanks again. Thanks very much. Very interesting and useful information.
My pleasure. You ask all the right questions, Justin, so you're very easy to talk to.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Self-Sovereign. If you found it interesting or useful, then subscribe to the podcast and share it with others. Also, please check out the links in the description, which are related to what was discussed today. And don't forget to leave a comment and let us know what you think about this important subject.